You're listening to Doug Pagitt Radio.
Yeah. Welcome back to Pagitt Radio, broadcasting live out of the Twin Cities and around the world. Maybe even up in the space station, being shaped and shaping others. Like it's the Higgs boson of radio. Religious radio, that's not quite right. Jonathan Dudley has written a little book called Broken Words, The Abuse of Science and Faith in American Politics. And we're going to chat it up with him. So we'll give him a little ring.
Where is he in the world?
You know, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that.
That's okay.
I don't know where he is. Let's ask him where he is.
Doesn't really matter.
I should know. His book.
I don't know. Maybe I should know, but
His book is. Jonathan Dudley, how are you, buddy?
Doing?
Hey, I love it that you're listening to the show. Just before we call.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Jonathan Dudley, can you dig it? Hey, Jonathan, thanks for being on the show today, and thanks for your book.
Thank you for having me.
The book is called Broken Words, The Abuse of Science and Faith in American Politics.
That's right.
And you, Jonathan, you do a lot of things. Are you still currently a fourth-year medical student?
I am, yep.
holy cats.
So did you write a book while you were in med school?
Well, I started it while I was in divinity school before medical school, and I finished it in medical school. So
Okay, so did you go to preschool?
I did, yeah.
Okay, preschool, kindergarten, elementary school, junior high, high school, college, divinity school. Some people call seminary, but I like divinity school better. It sounds way more awesome.
It is, yeah.
And then med school.
That's right. That's right.
Jonathan, what are you going to do with your life to be valuable in this world?
I go to school. I mean, I provide the salary for lots of teachers. And
You do. You
That's
live.
right. You're supporting the whole educational system.
that's right.
Jonathan,
your
you're just living off the dole. Hey, so what prompted you in the midst of all of that, and with all the books that you could have been reading in the course of your 8 schools, to decide to write a book?
Well, okay. So to explain a little bit about that, I grew up in a very evangelical family in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Both my parents went to Moody Bible Institute, which is kind of like a flagship fundamentalist Bible college for people who aren't familiar with it. And their worldview really shaped the beliefs that I had as a kid. Rejection of evolution, suspicion towards environmentalism, the idea that Christian politics should center around abortion. And one of the things that's common in that in the evangelical culture I was from is to send your kid to an evangelical school with the assumption that they'll have their beliefs reinforced. So I went to Calvin College, and I found that at Calvin, which is an evangelical school in Grand Rapids, it seemed that most of the professors actually didn't agree with the lay evangelical community on a lot of issues like evolution, environmentalism, and even on things like abortion. And as I started reading books by professors at other similar evangelical liberal arts colleges, I discovered that there was a significant gap between what a lot of these scholars believe and what a lot of the lay evangelicals believe. So I felt like it would be valuable to expose that discrepancy and explain some of the reasons for it.
Great.
And
so my book focuses specifically on 4 issues that involve biology and scripture, evolution, abortion, gay marriage, and environmentalism. With evolution, for example, if you poll the biology faculty at places like Calvin College or Gordon College, you'll find that all of them accept some version of the theory of evolution and do not accept ideas like intelligent design or creationism, which I find interesting. On a topic like environmentalism, that's becoming less controversial among evangelicals, but still, there's very strong support for it within the scholarly segment, not as much within the lay segment. And on topics like gay marriage and abortion, it's less of a big gap, but there's still a lot more diversity of opinion in these schools than there is within the lay community.
And so you were trying to say, hey, lay folks, hey, regular folks, non-professional and non academics. you're okay to think about these issues differently than you might think that let's borrow the phrase, the evangelical intelligentsia tells you that you can believe on these topics.
Exactly. Yeah. Um,
So I do want to talk about each of those topics because I think they're fascinating.
Uh-huh.
I think you've done good work on them. But you were busy. Why'd you decide to write a book when you had all this other stuff going on?
well, there's one major reason I decided to write this book was because while I was at Kelvin, I had a professor he's a tenured professor there that teaches bioethics, and he told me about his experience in the 1980s where he wrote a book about abortion. And he wrote it with a number of other evangelical scholars, and it was a very nuanced book, but it ultimately ended up being a critique of the religious rights thinking on the issue.
Mhm.
And as a result, there was this massive wave of protests, demands that he resign, a huge controversy. And he told me that, people who are employed by evangelical institutions, even though they often hold very different positions on these issues, are afraid to speak out about them because of the backlash it can generate. And my career goal has always ultimately been to go into medical research. I've never had any desire to be employed by an evangelical institution or college or as a pastor.
I see.
And so I felt that I
So you
had
got a
much of a
pass on that.
leeway
Yeah.
to speak out against these issues and to present alternative perspectives than a lot of my professors had. So
It's pretty awesome to think about it that way. Like, who is positioned to speak on a topic where other folks can't or won't? I mean, I think all of us have certain kinds of spheres of influence that we don't always consider. And it's just an interesting way to approach the possibility of doing something, which I really dig.
So when you decided you're gonna write this book, you went after these hot topics, and I'm sure you've gotten this response because I get it a lot, where people will say, especially leaders, and this is a very concerning thing to me. Leaders or people who might review a book or people who might be have a role of influence in evangelicalism will tend to say, you know what, like personally, I really agree with you on all this, but I can't say it out loud. Like I can't talk about it. I can't be as public as you are. Thanks for being out there so that it kind of gives some cover for the rest of us. And then they'll actually say things like, now in public, I'm wondering if you've heard this kind of thing where people will say, I've read John's book. I don't agree with everything he says, and then they go from there, right? Like sort of this caveat of cover, which to my personality and temperament, and because of the I guess the kinds of particles I have run around with in my life, I find that to be really gutless and like, kind of chicken shit, actually, that people are like, really, I believe this, but I can't say it because, I got to pay a mortgage. Doesn't feel like leadership. So I'm wondering, do you think from your vantage point of where you've come from and the writing you've done, do you think that some of the issue in evangelicalism is that it really lacks a conviction of leadership on some of these issues?
Yeah, I think that's definitely could be said to be true. I think a major cause of that, I think evangelicalism, and one of the topics I talk about in this book is that they're just these litmus tests for being a good evangelical. The stance you take on controversial topics like abortion or gay marriage or universalism. That really stifles the intellectual diversity that's necessary for really robust thinking and scholarship to occur. So, I can empathize with people who are, pastors at an evangelical church and have a family to feed and a mortgage to pay and don't want to become martyrs for the cause. But, at the same time, I think it's helpful for those who are not in that position to really do what they can to change the culture so that it becomes more feasible for leaders who are more entrenched in the culture to speak their mind on these topics as well. So, and
were you hoping in some ways that your book could provide that kind of cover for them, where they could say, "Hey, go ahead and read this," or you could sort of hang around these ideas that you're suggesting in broken words, so that so they could move the idea forward a little bit without having to personally be the advocates of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does do that to some extent. And I think more directly, it just opens up certain arguments within the evangelical community that you might not hear otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a few months ago, I wrote an op-ed for CNN titled "When Evangelicals Were Pro-Choice,"
Yeah.
and it basically looks at the fact that in the 1960s and early 1970s, most mainstream evangelical leaders, including people at places like Dallas Theological Seminary and Christianity Today, thought the Bible clearly taught that life begins at birth. And there's this very rapid transition in thinking that occurred with the rise of the evangelical right later in the 1970s. And the Mark Galley, who's now the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, started a dialogue with me on that issue. He wrote 2 different entries, both of them quite long. And it
As
really,
is Mark's way.
yeah.
I know Mark. I like him a lot, but man, that guy can write a
yeah.
lot of words in a short amount of time.
It really introduced a topic for debate into the evangelical community that you might not hear someone more firmly within its boundaries bring up. So,
And okay, and I think that's a good illustration of what you're wanting to do in the book, because that issue of when certain religious leaders chose the issue of abortion, and combined with what they saw as the overreach of the Supreme Court and federalism, right? These two things together became the new opportunity for churches to have, for religious leaders, in this case evangelicals, to have something to stand against. So they were then able to use that as the pivot point. And there are, and maybe you wrote about this in your op-ed, there's a very clear conversation trail of when leaders decided abortion's going to be the political topic that we're going to use to put out a calling card to people, so they'll know which side we're on, because they lost the issue of divorce and they were losing the issue of segregation. So they had to pick something else, and they picked this one. And there were many people who were discomforted by that. But by that particular choice. So it had a very deep political sensibility to it. And in the subtitle of your book is The Abuse of Science and Faith in American Politics. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So both the title and the subtitle. So I title it Broken Words because there's this idea in the Christian tradition that both the Bible and nature are like 2 different books written by the same author, like 2 different words by God. You find this in in documents like the Belgic Confession, with the idea that, nature is like a book before us. And I think the evangelical community has really abused both the Bible and science in pursuing its political agenda. Just to go back to the topic of abortion, there's evangelical leaders have widely embraced the idea that the Bible teaches that life begins at conception. And this has, become almost a mainstream position within the lay evangelical community. But this funny thing is that interpretation of the Bible is very new historically, and it really doesn't have that much support, and it makes it disingenuous when the same leaders then protest that proponents of gay marriage are twisting the Bible to support political motives. So I think that's one area where the Bible is abused. And in terms of the abuse of science, I think it runs throughout all of the 4 issues I discussed, whether it's, trying to circumvent the scientific community by having intelligent design put directly in public schools, the continual denials of the mainstream scientific consensus on global warming, the claim not only that embryonic stem cell research is morally wrong, which is a perfectly legitimate claim to make, but that there are no possible discoveries that could be uncovered by pursuing it. Instead of, I think it's really unfortunate. There are folks in the evangelical community who share conservative moral positions and see Everett Koop, who died recently, the former Surgeon General, is a great example of this, who shared these conservative moral positions, but refused to distort science to support them. But I think, sadly, the tendency and the willingness to essentially lie or to manipulate facts and to present theories that are untrue has become really common within the evangelical community in service to their moral agenda. So that's, both the Bible and science, I think, are twisted in the process.
And everybody's got a reason for spending all the time when they're going to put a big project together, and a book is certainly a big project. So people have multiple reasons for doing such a thing. Was part of your working on these ideas in this book related to your own desire to be in medical research and wanting to wrestle with the ideas of your own family heritage and of the religious system that you see so evidently, in the world and in life because of your own engagement in it? Were you trying to work out some space for you to be able to function in the medical research field in some ways? Like, is there something about science and wanting science to have more freedom than religious people have tended to give it, because there was for you personally, some big benefit of what can come out of good and right medical research?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I really think that all books are ultimately in some ways reflections on their authors' biographies. And part of the book is explicitly a coming of age story about growing up in the evangelical community and encountering alternative perspectives on these issues. But I really think there are resources within the evangelical tradition itself, and certainly within the broader Christian tradition, to support a higher view, a higher respect for science. Whether you have, Charles Hodge in the 1800s saying that the idea that the Bible should be interpreted by science is all but self-evident. The two books tradition that views the Bible and nature as two books inspired by God. So I think there are a lot of resources within the evangelical tradition to support a more robust engagement with science. And as someone who has a lot of respect for science and wants to pursue science to help others, and also is concerned about how science is used in political discussions, I think it would be valuable for evangelicals to reclaim that heritage. And I think you really can't be a competent science without having a sense that there's a world out there to be discovered. And that we need to respect the findings of research and not start off with an ideology and try to find facts to support it. So,
Jonathan, one of the things that our social science friends tell us and our psychological friends tell us is that human beings like to order themselves and arrange themselves in social groupings, and part of social grouping is having names and titles for things. They like to have, human beings over time have tended to develop names and of communities, or names of tribes, or names of races, because it just seems to be something inside the human experience that wants to put a name on it for it to be legitimate and for it to be real. So for many evangelicals, the name evangelical, the term evangelical, the word is partly an existential part of an existential kit of what makes them them. Knowing how important it is, do you define yourself as an evangelical? I mean, I know a lot of people say things like, and I say this kind of stuff all the time, so people can call it on me too. Like, you know what? I'm not into labels. I don't like labels and all this kind of thing. It's just not true, right? Human beings organize around a whole set of labels and names, and now they give more power to some or to less. But do you still call yourself an evangelical?
I don't call myself an evangelical. And part of the reason for that is that I think the best hope for changing the face of Orthodox Christianity in America won't come from reforming evangelicalism, but will come from people who are disillusioned with evangelicalism, leaving it to start an alternative community. And there's no reason why that couldn't be called evangelicalism as well, but I think it's probably more confusion than it's worth. And I think it reinforces the false idea that the way to produce change is to convince, like Albert Mohler, that evolution occurred, or to convince the editorial board of Christianity Today of alternative positions on abortion. I just don't think that change will really happen by convincing the older generation to change their minds, as opposed to by a newer generation that kind of charts their own path. So.
And the reason I ask is because, there's a lot of books that are written on from evangelicals to evangelicals about our common faith. And that's why I was wanting to poke at a bit with your book, because some of us who read those kinds of books feel like, well, I'm glad that conversation's happening, but there's still a commitment to keeping certain understandings and ideas in place in that world that one might not want if they were going to be saying, evangelicals, I used to be one of you. I was given that heritage by people who loved me and cared for me and encouraged me, but I don't see myself as a part of the ranks anymore. That a book can either be a calling card for us inside of a situation like evangelicalism, or a calling card for those who felt that they already are on the outside of evangelicalism. And yours is a book for those who are willing to step outside of it.
Yeah, and what I try to do in my writing is appeal to the ideas that most evangelicals take for granted, to argue them into a different way of looking at things. So I'm not entirely outside of it in my arguments. Like I think most evangelicals would see my arguments, at least in some ways, as hopefully somewhat convincing to them based on the beliefs they already hold. So
okay, so let me ask you this one, and I get this a lot too on the because I'm involved in many similar projects, and I like when people ask this question. How's that going for you? I mean, how is that? Because the evangelical world can bring a smackdown pretty hard on those who have tasted of the fruit and have walked away from the table.
Well, I think that's it's certainly naive to think that everyone who reads a book will be convinced by it. But at the same time, I do think that there are different patterns of responses. So I think that younger people in particular tend to be very open on these issues. Their beliefs aren't set in stone yet. And I've gotten lots of emails from younger people raised evangelicals that have said, this really changed how I think. It's really changed my perception of the community. Certainly a lot of the older ones and even some younger ones aren't going to be convinced by it. But I think the idea that you can write a book and convince everyone, of course, is silly. But I don't think that means you can't have some social impact with a book or with your writing.
You never know how things are going to move through people's minds and hearts over time and shape in it. I mean, how many of us have had professors or educators who have said things that didn't quite sink in to us until decades later? And so you just never know how something like this might over time work on somebody, even secretly, because maybe they're afraid or unwilling to admit for various reasons. Because like Doug's saying, I think a lot of us who have been a part of evangelical communities have felt that smackdown, whether it's in a Bible study or in a larger group setting, and it can be really, really uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean that the ideas won't work on folks. Are you finding that you're hearing from, besides young people, other people who have read your book that are within and without the evangelical community? I mean, you're hearing from both sides of it?
Yeah.
Assuming there's sides. It's not really.
Yeah, and I think the book kind of has a dual audience. One is the evangelical community, and particularly young people and people more towards the middle of the theological spectrum that are more open to being convinced on these issues. But also like the secular American community, I think it's valuable for them to have a more nuanced portrait of the evangelical community, and also for them to understand what I think are a lot of the problems with the evangelical community's thinking. One thing that often happens with these smackdowns you're talking about is that the focus is less on challenging your arguments and more on just presenting you as an outsider.
Or
And
ad
so
hominem
when
attacks.
those do occur, and Mark Galley certainly attempted to smack me down in responding to my CNN op-ed as an example, I think it's really valuable to shift the focus back to the arguments and really engage them in the arguments. Because I think on that level, these positions don't have as much of a chance of succeeding, or they're not as strong when you really focus on the reasons for these beliefs, as opposed to
That's good
whether or not
advice.
you're on the right side of the litmus test.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I applaud you for that, and I think it's so important that people do that. And at the same time, I'm becoming more convinced that as people, especially religiously committed people, I think we tend to hold our beliefs because they come with a whole package of other kinds of engagement. That the community that I'm in thinks this, so I think it. Or these are people who loved me, or these are people who care for me, or this is where my job is, or this is my heritage. And strangely, people don't find themselves being evangelical only because they picked all the right. They went through a list and picked the topics. You know, like you didn't go to like myreligion.com and say, here's the things I think, and then it gave you a religion, like you're on kayak trying to find a hotel or something. That people are really complex, and so people are willing to hold beliefs. I mean, I have a lot of Catholic friends for whom this is really sort of clear. They're like, look, I wouldn't have come up with it. I wouldn't even say it that way, but it's just what my people say, so I don't screw with it anymore. I'm either in or out. And I think that evangelicals know this, and they know that they're not going to lose on the they're not going to lose because someone presents different ideas. They're going to lose because they're going to win because people don't want to be alone. And I think it's incumbent on a lot of us, me and you and Victoria and other listeners, to say, if we could create an alternative community for people to be involved in, where there's people who love you and care for you, and where you can be engaged and you can be thoughtful, and there can be sort of a comprehensive way of looking at the world, and you can be engaged with other people through all this like complex social ordering that religion provides for people, then people would have a tendency to move at a much more rapid pace than the few of us who are willing to say, like, I'm okay sitting in that field out there by myself because I know these topics are so powerful.
And how freeing would that be for
Yeah.
people who are sitting in evangelical communities, thinking, feeling differently, not willing to admit it because the cost of loss of friends and
I mean, that's where the
exile.
smackdown
Yeah, it's
comes,
so
right? Is
horrible.
that you're going to be put outside by yourself. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jonathan? Does that ring a bell with you at all, or?
Yeah, I think that's a very good insight, and I think it's certainly important to establish alternative communities that people can be a part of, and I think people shift the communities they identify with for various reasons. For some people, it's more how supported they feel and how much they like the people around them.
Right.
For other people, it is more how convincing do I find this community to be, or what's my sense of its intellectual respectability. So I think that the type of writing I do is going to be more effective with people who identify with communities more because of the intellectual reasons than the emotional ones. But I think it's definitely important to have those alternative communities that can support both kinds of people.
Yeah, and I think one of the changes that's happening in our society, and we're going to be talking with a fellow named David Hayward in a minute, who started a thing called The Lasting Supper, which is an online community. I think one of the things that online communities can solve for people is spanning the location difficulty that people have. Folks find themselves living in a small town or in a big town, but they only know certain people, and they don't know where to go to be around other people with these ideas to give them a sense of identity and a sense of engagement and involvement and support. And so the internet might provide one of the ways in which people can find alternative communities to identify with, so that they're freed up to be more accepting for the ideas like you're trying to suggest. So it really could be that we're in the midst of some pretty significant change in the global patterning that will allow people to engage in some new and fresh ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Well, okay, Jonathan, we so appreciate you being on the show. The book is great. People should buy it. It's called Broken Words. It's in hardback and soft cover, right? Or the expensive and the not as expensive version?
Hardback and Kindle right now.
Hardback and Kindle right now. All right, Jonathan, before I let you go, I want to ask you 3 questions. I want to ask you questions about 3 movies. Have you watched any of these movies? Do you know them? Have you ever watched a movie called Stripes with Bill Murray?
No.
Have you ever watched a movie called The Warriors from 1979?
I have, yeah, and I heard you were playing a clip from that.
Oh,
Yeah.
Can you dig it?
Can you dig it?
Do you remember that line? Do you remember that from the movie?
Yeah.
It's just so iconic. I mean, it's I don't know how people
Such a funny movie.
It is just a cult.
Can you dig it?
It's just a cult classic.
Can you dig it?
Yes.
Can you dig it?
I think that needs to come back into popular parlance. All right, and the third movie, have you heard a movie called Billy Jack?
I don't think I've heard of that one.
Yes, I win.
All right. Well,
1 for 3.
1 for 3. Or as Meatloaf would say, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. All right. Hey, Jonathan, thanks thanks so much for being on the show and for all the work you do. And when you find your way to Minneapolis sometime, I know you got some friends over here.
Great. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Okay, buddy. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
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 So that's Jonathan Dudley. I think you should go pick up the book. He's a guy that's watched a couple
great.
of. Well, yeah, it was great. Yeah, I really thought that. I think that was
I liked talking to him.
I like talking with him. I like the idea of the book. I think people should pick it up. I think for some people who want to have like a book for a book club and they want to engage those ideas, I think this is one that might help people sort of push the edges a little bit.
Well, and for some of us, sometimes you're used to be in evangelical communities and aren't. I mean, sometimes I find myself in a position where my friends are asking me, like, why do they do this? Why are blah, blah. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. It can kind of help put words to maybe some sensibilities that some of us couldn't articulate.
Yeah, very good.
So
we're going to be back here with David Hayward. David's starting a little thing called The Lasting Supper. So hang with us here on Doug Pagitt Radio, broadcasting live out of the Twin Cities all over the world from Peacedale Studios. We'll be back here after the break.